So for our next segment, we've got a panel, and it's going to be themed around leading through disruption. So I'm just doing a brief introduction on the three leaders that we have here with us today for this. So we're basically going to give a presentation, and then we're going to have some panel questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So first up is Lorna Martin. She's the Senior Vice President of Technology and a global technology leader with a diverse experience in financial services, telecommunications spanning 30 years. In 2022, she was appointed the Regional Chair for Fidelity Investments Ireland, and prior to that, for the previous 5 years, she was the Head of Technology. In her 18-year career at Fidelity, she's held several leadership positions both in Ireland and the United States. And I think it would be perfect timing maybe to recognise Lorna is getting recognised tomorrow night by the American Chamber for a Global Leadership Award. It's their inaugural award, and this honours an individual who has made a significant and positive impact on US-Irish business relations and is a committed advocate for inclusion and gender diversity. So we congratulate Lorna. And next up then we'll have Rory Conroy. Rory is the Vice President of Sales Development and the Galway site lead at Diligent. In his role, Rory leads a team of 50 people to drive Diligent's growth in EMEA and APAC region. Diligent is a global leader in modern governance, providing SaaS solutions across governance, risk, compliance and ESG. And in 2020, Diligent opened its European hub here in Galway. Rory has held previous senior leadership positions in SiteMinder, Adroll, Google, and he brings a wealth of experience in sales marketing, building team culture. And he also lectures here part-time at the University of Galway, bringing students into the workplace and helping enrich their learning experience. And then up next, we'll have Kieran Conboy. He is a Professor of Business Information Systems in the School of Business and Economics and is a co-principal investigator in the Lero Irish Software Research Centre. He previously worked for Accenture Consulting and the University of New South Wales in Australia. He's also on the board of the Irish Research Council. Kieran has published over 150 articles in leading international journals and conferences, and he is the editor of the European Journal of Information Systems and has chaired several international conferences in his field. So I'm going to welcome them all up to do their presentation, and then we'll join them later for a panel.
Good morning, everybody. Alma, that was an amazing presentation. I'm glad I'm not using Irish stats because you've covered the whole gambit there. So I'm just going to very quickly talk about, I think Rory's slides are up there. I'm actually going to give you a gift today. And the gift is I'm not using any slides because we're talking about leadership today. And, one of the most important but less practiced skills is actually the skill of active listening. So I think we're going to have a great opportunity this morning across the board there. So our leadership team actually were for several months prior to the pandemic, and indeed for the last 3 years, have been focused on the future of work. Because pre-pandemic, and we didn't even know it was coming, Fidelity had already made a decision to reduce real estate in Ireland, and while actively growing. So we've grown significantly over the last couple of years, but really it was focused on experimenting of what the future of work might look like, both in terms of the types of practices and the structure of our office space. Little did we know, we usually have a couple of years to kind of roll these things in, but we actually went through 2 major change curves, as did everyone in this room. So, we're going to discuss probably a lot of things on the panel related to that. But as Alma mentioned, leadership development is crucial. And 12 months ago, I was talking a lot about McKinsey survey, which talked about only 20% of our leaders felt prepared to lead talent in this new paradigm of work. And my mantra, and some of you probably are sick listening to me on this one, has been for several years is, the so-called soft skills of the past are the essential skills of the future. They're the essential skills of now and the future. And, those skills are things like we've already discussed this morning, like empathy, creating a culture of psychological safety, and the aforementioned active listening. So I don't worry too much, even though I am a technologist, at the next generation of, multi-cloud strategies or the threat vector, or large language models, that we're all kind of citizen AI experts at the moment. They are important, but having lived through, many eras of technology, being 30 years in the business, living through Y2K, living through, the age of distributed computing, the emergence of, things like open source that we were all so worried about, but now are part of the day-to-day. I don't worry about the technology, it takes care of itself. But the human element is absolutely the toughest, the most powerful and the most sustaining element of what we do. Last week, I was in our Boston office and I met Chloe, who helped me find a conference room. Chloe is a robot. She's a badged associate and one of our non-human members of our workforce. So Chloe kind of removed that friction for me finding my way around the building. I hadn't been in that particular floor for a while, but it gave me some more time to do things that were more valuable. And although Chloe trumped me on her knowledge of 245 Summer Street, I have an asset that she doesn't have, and that's humanity. The next day I had lunch with my colleague Paulina. She's a cybersecurity expert, and a significant part of Paulina's job is she's part of the sales team for our workplace investing organisation. And for those of you who might not be so familiar with Fidelity, our workplace investing team, I suppose on an aspirational level, manage the dreams and aspirations of our customers. On a more product level, we provide products for pension funds, for healthcare, for people planning for retirement and so forth. But Paulina also has a digital twin, also called Paulina. And, Paulina is not in the least bit threatened by her synthetic humanoid Paulina. Because what happens there is, as they meet for sales, there are a lot of questions, standard questions, that companies are interested in terms of our products and platforms. And synthetic Paulina brings them through all of that, which allows human Paulina to really spend time actively engaging in conversations on the areas that are highly complex and highly human. And, this is probably a vision of, many of the ways we're going to create space into the future in the workforce. Allowing us to be human, giving us time for those nuanced conversations, for active listening and empathy, and generally those things that require more bandwidth. And, as early speakers mentioned, that social connection is probably a big part of that challenge. Connecting us with each other, really creating that culture in our organizations. So now if you think about the examples of, Paulina and Chloe, and think about you as leaders can create bandwidth, well, where do we invest it? So I'm going to cite two studies, and both of these happen to be from Gartner, and they're pretty recent. So the first is based on a 2001 manager effectiveness survey of approximately 3,000 employees. And the real question was do leaders who focus on creating psychological safety in their environments with teams maximize outcomes? And the answer is a resounding yes. And if you look at some of the outcomes, so 6% upside on engagement, 41% upside on intent to stay, 36% on sustainable performance, and 41% on how they perceive their employer brand. So, now we know that, thinking about, as leaders, how do we create space? How do we create psychological safety? The final thought for you to consider today is, does your personal leadership style, fit in the new paradigm of work? And I'm going to cite a second Gartner study recently published earlier this year, and it's based on a study of over 10,000 employees, 5,000 managers in over 100 companies. And this is focused on the question, why? Why do some leaders build exceptional talent and others don't? And the first finding falls into, the finding was each type of leader falls into a profile. Now, I know you're all probably familiar with situational leadership and lots of other, but ultimately we all have a dominant profile in terms of how we operate. So the four kind of primary profiles they came up with is, there are teachers. They're those who develop based on their expertise and experience. And teachers are often very prescriptive. They like the work done exactly as they would have done it. Then there's the always-on leader. We all know these. These are the mantras. I provide continuous coaching and learning, and I'm always there for you. And these are probably the ones who are checking in every morning during the pandemic to see, were you at work and were you okay? But again, they tend to be the ones who are micromanagers. Then we have the cheerleader. So the cheerleader's mantra is, I enable my people to take care of their own development and take that into their own hands. but all my people are brilliant. And we often hear those in many organisations, particularly around, end of year review time or mid-year review time. And, but essentially these tend to be quite hands-off leaders, and they're kind of, find me if you need me. And finally, we have the connectors. And their mantra, really is focused on, they understand what their people are passionate about. They take the time to have the question, the conversation, create the human connection. They ask about aspirations. They're not afraid of losing people because they take great joy in people that they've developed moving on to other roles. And they're excited about bringing new talent into organisations. And so given Philip's earlier conversation on connected leaders, don't be surprised by the second finding. So they looked at, those outcomes. So teachers negatively impact sustainable performance by 14%. The always-on leaders have absolutely no impact on their teams. The cheerleader improves sustainable performance by 15%, but that's probably down to belief and confidence. And the connector has a radically positive impact on sustainable performance at 45%. So hopefully this provides a little bit of food for thought on the importance of the human skills and the impact of being a connected leader. Thank you.
Good morning, folks. I hope you're all well. Unfortunately, unlike Lorna, I'm not going to give you the gift of no slides, but hopefully they won't be too taxing. And I think you'll see and hopefully appreciate some common themes that have come up from the earlier presentations, which have been excellent. But I do believe, and as building on the comment from the gentleman there earlier, we're in a very precarious position, I believe, as a nation, from an added value perspective. Our wages have never been higher, the cost of living has never been higher, employee engagement is down, employee retention is down, and our productivity is becoming compromised. So our unique positioning in the global footprint of being attractive as an expansion for global business is being eroded by this trend. And we really need to sit up as leaders and take control of it. And I really do believe that the big piece that is missing is the leadership adaptation to a hybrid way of working. Overnight, over 3 years ago, the world went from that environment of huddling around desks, overhearing conversations, going for coffee chats, reading body language, doing all the stereotypical things that we were groomed to do for tens of decades, perhaps even centuries in some capacity. And overnight that's changed. That's 3 years ago, which is ancient history at this stage. And this is how we lead. But has our leadership and our management ways caught up with the way of working? I don't believe it has. And this is why I fundamentally believe there is a significant challenge when it comes to employee engagement and productivity and employee retention, because we haven't built the same type of emotional connections with employees. Their emotional connections with the companies they work for have been eroded as a result, and it's much easier to resign and move on, because we've all stayed in companies in the past too long, not because we love the work, but because we love the people. We found it hard to leave the people. We're really struggling over the last number of years to build meaningful relationships between people and with companies, and therefore the ability to retain and drive productivity, which comes with advanced tenure, is under significant threat. And the management role in general is a really, really difficult role. It always has been. You've got this pressure top down, you've got this pressure bottom up, and fundamentally you're probably one of the not most influential person on how an employee feels, not just professionally but personally. So the responsibility and impact a manager has is significant, but the change in the ways of working over the last number of years has compounded this pressure dramatically, and the responsibility of a manager has gone up. But how have we as leaders and organisations supported and trained and developed our leaders and managers to be able to adapt to the changing way of working? And if we haven't, and we're still deploying management strategies that worked 3 years ago, you can really be sure that they are not effective now. And that's why we are seeing some of the stats that Alma threw up there as well in terms of retention and that connectivity that people have or don't have with the companies they work for. And because of this, leadership's under a dramatic microscope in terms of the impact you have, because your opportunity to create that impact is often on a 14-inch screen. And the way that you choose to use that time is critically important. We could get away with it in the past because if you botch up a presentation and a leadership message, you could go one-to-one and pick someone up, or if you can read the room. It's very difficult to read a room when the cams are off. And that importance of leadership has gone to a whole different level of influence. And this is where some of the core fundamentals of being a true leader that have always been there but are more important than ever come through, and that's that authenticity. It's the ability to build that rapport and connection with the people that you work with. And the importance of doing that is that you're not going to have so many opportunities in front of people in a hybrid working environment for them to get to know you. So you do need to really bring your true authentic self to the office and create an environment where people can reciprocate and do the same. And the importance then of being that true authentic leader is an added importance of transparency. One of the most important things we look for in life, and full stop, but in work, is security. And when we were all in the one environment in terms of physical office space, we could have those change management conversations on the fly and more double down on certain individuals. It's so important that as we continue to move fast as organizations and grow and develop and be ambitious, that we ensure we bring people on that journey with us and we have a clear, transparent way of doing it. And we have to over-index that because of the fact that we're not around our organizational staff all the time. And this really comes down to incredibly clear communication. And again, this isn't just what is said, it's how it's said, it's the tone, it's the pace, and it's ensuring that that is followed up by multiple different touch points of how you get that communication across, because you're trying to engage with an audience that are in very different situations, both physically and perhaps mentally, than they would have been when they were all back in the office or in the office prior to COVID. And that communication channel needs to be something that is driven by embracing technology. We've heard enough scaremongering around the AI kind of overlords that are taking over. The fact of the matter is tech and SaaS businesses have been leveraging the power of technology and AI for a long, long time. That's why they've become such successful industries and why Ireland Inc. has benefited so much from it. But we need to embrace that technology, whether it's Zoom, breakout rooms and polls and utilising tools like Slack and driving that level of engagement. Technology should be seen as a phenomenal partner to communicate and engage staff and lead staff in the hybrid environment. And what that can give us back is time. But it's what we do with that time that matters, and that time really does need to be invested in creating, as was cited a couple of times earlier, those real kind of human moments of engagement and building rapport. If you're on your kind of hybrid model of being in the office 2 or 3 days a week and out the other days, what's the point in being in the office and sitting on Zoom calls back to back if you're not using that time to actually build relationships with your team when they're there? So how you organize your time and ensure that you have a hybrid calendar as well as an in-person calendar as a leader is so important, because people go as the leader goes. And if you're displaying traits and behaviors that are very much kind of secondary to human interactions and the more transactional, which was mentioned earlier, your team will mimic that, and it's very hard to fall in love with something that's purely transactional. And that's what we want for employees, to fall in love with the work they do and the people they're with and the culture they're with and contribute to it. And unless we have a really good grasp of our work-life balance genuinely, and a lot of leaders are really crap at this, but unless we really put a weight of importance on it for ourselves, how are we expected to put that weight of importance on our team of having a good work-life balance? And that's really, really important to create in a hybrid environment, because it's how we carve out of that work time those moments that matter and those human moments that matter. And regardless of whether people are in person or hybrid, the genie's out of the bottle. That's here to stay. So we have to adapt our leadership style and the way we create engagements in a hybrid environment. And the glue that can connect a lot of this together is the company values and the company culture, and ensuring that you bring these values to life in a really meaningful way. And I guess from an example from ourselves in Diligent, D&I is a really, really important part of our culture and DNA within the Galway office. And we create these moments during the year, whether it's Pride Week, that is a fully interactive week, both online and in person, or whether it's our Day of Service, where globally we partner with different charities around the world, and we go out and earn the right to be part of that community by giving back to that community and reminding the folks that work for our company that you're an elitist top 1% of the population of the world. You have to earn the right to be part of a community like Galway. And it's unless you really, I believe, build that culture around values in a very authentic way, you're not going to have that same experience, because we run the risk of people being advantaged or disadvantaged depending on where they sit on a certain day of a week. But the skill of a leader is really to make sure that everyone feels fully included regardless of where they sit, either in the office or remotely. So if there's any takeaways that might be beneficial, I think it really is around owning it as a leader, and we have to own this as leaders, and we can kind of really turn this on, and should be turning this on if we're not, around leading with purpose, through authenticity, through transparency, through really clear and meaningful communication, and ensuring that we're not assuming, but ensuring that we're bringing people on the journey with us. We need to own the influence that we have on the employees that we have. And we need to create those environments where often you're giving the power of culture not top down, but it's bottom up. It's crowdsourcing. We talked a little bit about how we are engaging the 20-something-year-olds and lower tenured employees that are coming into the workplace. We need to be comfortable giving control to the 20-something-year-olds to create the culture that's meaningful for them, not organising fun like a happy hour and nobody wants to go to it. There's no point thinking that, or for me to think that I should plan the culture and the activities for Diligent. I would have lost my job a long time ago if that was the case. I need to trust the talent that we bring in, create opportunities for them to identify areas and topics they're really passionate about, and create these little subcultures and pockets where people gravitate and have options to gravitate towards what they're passionate about as well. So that's me owning the experience. I'm not driving it, but I'm facilitating it. And then lastly, it's about the values. You know, often, and they have been in the past, a tick box exercise of this is what we stand for, it's transparency, it's whatever it might be. But we really need, in a hybrid world, that has the potential to create the glue of really connecting people to the company. But it needs to worm its way into the vernacular of everything that's done in a business, from one-to-ones to team meetings to awards that are giving out. It needs to be brought to life, and we need to work harder at it, because people don't just get it. They got it when everyone is around, and people had this kind of contagious effect of learning and figuring stuff out. That contagion is gone, thanks to a different contagion. And because of that, we have to work harder at ensuring that we have a mission, we have values, and those values are brought to life in a meaningful way that everyone can take part of and feel part of. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Rory. Unfortunately, I have no gift either. I have a few slides, but I think there's only 3 though, so not too bad. Okay, so our group here in the School of Business and Economics in Galway, we focus on research around time and technology. Now, time and technology is a very abstract concept, and we take a very broad, abstract approach. I'll give you a couple of very narrow examples later on. But all of our projects that we work on deal with some aspect of time and technology, and all of them are industry driven. So we work with a lot of companies, actually, funnily enough, not so much here in Ireland at the moment, mainly Nordic companies, Atlassian in Australia, Accenture in the UK, and then a couple of companies in the US and Canada as well. So if I try and wrap up or give some tangible meaning to the abstract term of time and technology, our overall motivation is quite simple. There's loads of technology leaders in the room here, all leading amazing teams, doing amazing things. Emerging new technology around AI and algorithms, analytics, blockchain, cloud, all of these amazing things. And while it's not always the main selling point of these technologies or main purpose, very often time is central or one of the most important features of that technology. So you're developing technology to make our lives faster, to allow us to access data immediately, to communicate with the global audience immediately, to analyze data in particular ways, very specific and dynamic ways immediately. So time is often there, these technologies are often there to make our time better, to leave more time to do other tasks, to leave more time with our families and social lives and leisure things and relaxing and all the other things that we'd like to do. So in 1930, J.M. Keynes, a famous economist, wrote a book about what he thought life would be like 100 years from now, due to technology. So his prediction was we would work 1.5 hours to 2 hours per day, because technology would automate more or less everything for us. And it would leave the rest of the day to spend with our family and our friends, social, leisure, and all of these other things. And 100 years on, whatever it is, 2030, we're 8 years, we're 7 years away from that 100 years now. Now, unless something radically changes in the next 7 years, the world we live in now is an awful lot more stressed. There's huge mental health issues. We all feel we have less time. I don't know anyone when you meet them that says, actually, you know, yeah, you might be okay, but I'm doing nothing at the moment. I'm relaxing, I'm taking it easy. We always lead with how many things we're doing and how we couldn't possibly do any more. And people are stressed, and it's not just in the workforce. Children and older people, stress levels and mental health issues are at an all-time high. Not all of those things are tech-related, but tech is playing definitely a fairly significant role in all of those things. So while all of this technology that you guys are developing and leading is supposed to make our lives easier and leave us more time to do things, we feel we have less and less time. And one simple counter-argument could be, well, the reason that we don't have less and less time is human nature. When you're left with free time, it's not meant to, we're not inclined to spend it with family and friends and leisure. We try to do more and more things and be more productive. Unfortunately, that's not true, though. Most studies of productivity, OECD reports and things like that, all show us as being, per capita, less productive than we were 20 or 30 years ago. So if we were using our time to produce more and more great things for the world, great. But it seems, I mean, if one was to take a very cynical or negative view, you'd say we're being busy fools on a global scale. So, So our goal in our group is to try in some small ways, try and understand this time and technology relationship, and maybe look at some of the complexities around time and technology that we maybe oversimplify in various things. So let me take two examples, because I know time and technology is too abstract. So I'll talk about two things, responsible technology and remote working, because they've both come up today, and they've definitely both come up as very central themes over the last couple of weeks. If I think about responsible AI or responsible technology, if our group were to challenge a few things that are going on in that at the moment, the first thing is all of us seem to be talking about responsible technology, and we need to be more ethical and fair and transparent and explainable. And all of these things are really, really important, vital things that we should be talking about. The unfortunate thing is when we all leave these rooms and we go back to the software development teams that are building these responsible technologies, you look at the kind of metrics and the way their lives are governed, and you see concepts like fail fast, velocity, sprints, pivot time, all of these things. It's all about time pressure and doing things, even if it's failing, it's doing the failing really fast. Agile methods that have 2-week sprints, that's seen as too slow now. Customers need to be able to change their mind much more than every 2 weeks. So we have to have flow and continuous development so they can change their mind every minute of every day. Now, I'm being a little bit facetious. I know we all love Agile. But again, the trend here is faster and faster and more aggressive. So while it's lovely to talk about responsible, when these teams are doing these things under these pressures, and you have a customer in an environment coming in saying, I now want this credit card functionality tomorrow, and I want this new feature, I want it to have a different image, I want it to look nicer, I want it to do whatever. Those kind of requirements tend to dominate. And the intangible stuff, the responsible and ethical things that are really important, tend not to make it into that priority list when you're under real pressure. So that's one concern. Another time concern is if you think about these discussions around responsible, there's great debates about whether something is responsible or not. Like, is it responsible to use AI for recruitment? Or is it responsible to use a particular technology for predicting, cancer diagnosis and things like that? And again, these debates are really important, but they tend to be these big judgments, like it's either ethical or it isn't. And one of the big problems is, I would say, coming at this from a time point of view, is there's no such thing as something being responsible or not. You might design some technology today that's responsible, and tomorrow, due to external or internal factors that you're not even aware of or couldn't possibly predict, all of a sudden that responsible has now become irresponsible. So a real challenge for developers is not just how to develop software that is responsible today, but you also have to be able to try and work out how the hell you design technology and design software that's responsible and will remain responsible in a dynamic environment where all kinds of things will be challenging that level of responsibleness. The last maybe challenge I'd say with all of these people that are discussing responsible is we tend to oversimplify and gloss over the time element, and the time bit is usually the complexities of time, not just speed and number of hours or days, but things like rhythm and time personality or temporal personality. Academics have to call it temporal to sound more important than just saying time. But if you look at somebody's temporal personality, those people who use those technologies can make a difference between something being responsible and not. So to give you an example, we often see in applications like for children's education or even children's use of tech, we see very simple statements like they shouldn't use it for more than an hour per day, or you shouldn't use the iPhone or whatever for an hour before bed. Okay? Now, unfortunately though, it's not as simple. I mean, 20 years ago when you watched the TV, then maybe, okay, you could say how many half hours or hours of TV are enough. But now you have digital companions and iPhones and digital robots, things that are prompting and interacting with the child. So 61-minute interactions where the robot or the phone pings and interrupts the child from a nap time or from learning or from something else. That's much more damaging, or at least is not as simple as saying one 60-minute slot. But we tend in these studies to look at how many minutes or hours in total is okay and responsible, when in actual fact it's the nature of that 60 minutes that's much more important. And when I think of the time personality issue, just to give you a simple example, we see a lot of children's technology, and for learning in the classroom and so on. But again, it's not about the minutes and hours. It's about the rhythm of the child. So if you have a child, let's say, with ADHD or autism, then a technology that's technically responsible for children generally can be devastating and incredibly irresponsible for a child with ADHD or autism who might react incredibly badly if their particular rhythm and their routine is disrupted, even by a small amount. So rhythm is a critically important concept that we look at with a lot of these companies. And again, if we think of maybe a silly example on rhythm, if you're running and you're listening to your favorite song and that beat changes or every third beat drops and the rhythm gets disrupted, it doesn't become 5% less nice to listen to, it becomes really, really annoying to listen to. So again, we look at the rhythm of technology and the impact of a technology on a child or a person's rhythm as being really important when we're deciding if something is responsible or not. One other thing I'd just like to talk a little bit about, and I know that I think everyone before me mentioned something about the time aspect, even though maybe not explicitly mentioning time, so things like stress and burnout and things like that. So yeah, I mean, I'm strong on the HR side. I know people that have talked before me definitely are. But just from my reading of some of the literature and stuff around this, one thing you see a whole range of organizational policies, from fully remote to fully on-site to formal on-site days and whatever. Now, number one, they're inconsistently enforced. So a real problem you have, even within our own university, there are some staff who have to apply for remote working for a day a week, 2 days a week, 3 days a week. Others have complete laissez-faire. They can come in and leave when they want. Others are told which 3 days that will be. Others, it's left to them to change the 3 days every week. And one real problem, I think, which we focus on a lot is it tends to be very simple. We tend to say a day a week at home, or a day a week in the office. And again, I'm not so sure that a day or 2 days or day and a half is particularly that important. It's more about the rhythm of people's work. It's more about, an event-driven approach. Like if some event happens on a Wednesday, then it might be really important in your organization that everybody is in on Thursday, depending on the nature of that event on the Wednesday. But we tend to not think about events. We don't think about the duties that are happening on a day-to-day basis. We don't think of the rhythm of work, and we don't think again of these time personalities and people who might feel incredibly isolated by working remotely, or those who might really dislike the concept of long commutes and coming into the office when, as somebody mentioned earlier, all you do is then come into the office and sit on Zoom calls with people that are sitting at home. So again, I think the organisational policies tend to be a little oversimplistic and just focus on days and hours. And national and EU policy around remote working tends to be the same. That in most countries, at least in Australia and Canada, and I think here, as these laws are emerging, again, they tend to focus on this really simplistic thing of a day a week or 2 days a week in the office or working from home or whatever. And they don't think about things like the rhythm of work and the disruption or impact that it's going to have. So we do a lot of work with different companies, some that are really struggling with this, and actually some that are doing a really, really good job and have come up with really nice, innovative ways of organising the time and doing it in an evidence-based manner. So just as one example, one project that we're just starting now in conjunction with MIT and Atlassian and a couple of the other Nordic countries, we're just kind of going to use trace data. So at the moment we're talking a lot about how we think we work and remote work and people are notoriously bad at recalling their time and estimating their time. So what we're going to do is just have little tracers on everyone, and again this is obviously an opt-in and a voluntary thing, but we're going to be able to see how many hours people spend at home, how much time they spend in the office, who exactly they came into proximity or contact with when they were in. So if they were in the office and just on Zoom calls with people sitting at home, then we'll know that. If they ended up interacting with 7 people, we'll know where they interacted with them and we'll be able to talk to them about how valuable that was. So it allows these companies to make a really strong evidence-based decision then when somebody says they really want to work from home or they want a policy or whatever it is, and a team are deciding how they're going to organise themselves. Our work gives them that evidence to show all of the patterns of activity, who's been where, and how all of that has gone, and how people feel about all of those interactions or lack of interactions, and allows them to make informed decisions and maybe try slight adjustments to policies, and then we'll track the data again and see where everyone is and how people conform or not, and be able to tweak that policy again further down the line, again in an evidence-based way. Anyway, that's, I think, all from me. Thank you very much.
Questions, yeah. Great. I'll go for this side. So I guess we can unequivocally say we didn't do very well with time because we're absolutely not on schedule. So just in the interest of that, I'm just going to throw 1 or 2 questions to the panel. And then we're actually going to open it to the floor with the aim of maybe trying to wrap up around 11:15 so that you can get a quick break and that we're, respectful of the next set of speakers. So with that, I think there's so many themes that we heard here this morning, from transactional, intentional, connected leaders. I guess, the purpose of these forums and the ability to be in a room together is to really hear, some practical strategies, either be it from yourselves as leaders or, things you're doing at maybe a larger scale within your organisation. So with that, I'll probably lead with, what areas of focus are you particularly, either as a leader, as I said, as an or on behalf of the organisation, are you doing to engage people? And I think there's plenty of examples and themes of stuff we heard here today. So maybe Rory, will I start with yourself there?
No worries, Sharon. I think I touched a little bit on it earlier in the presentation. I think it's taken the time to understand what your workforce are passionate about and where they're engaged, and building opportunities for them to rally around topics that they're passionate about. And we've talked, and it was raised a little bit earlier, topics like ESG and diversity and inclusion. These are all very strong themes if I look at how we operate our organisation. So we've created these employee resource groups that are fully employee driven. They've got executive sponsorship to ensure that if there's budget or funding or recognition required, that they really kind of get behind these employee resource groups. And essentially we're giving a platform to staff to celebrate what makes them different and what they're passionate about. So we've got 8 different ERGs, employee resource groups, globally, and then locally we create our own activations but stay connected with the company ERGs that are then connected to the values of the company. So they're some examples of things we do, whether it's rowing in behind different diversity initiatives and celebrations like the ones I talked about earlier, or even creating these little pockets of interest in hobby groups. So again, it's not company top-down deciding that here's the things you should go and be interested in. From my perspective at least, I think in the environment and hybrid environment that isn't going anywhere anytime soon, it's the employees that need to step up and become the culture rather than top-down being dictated what the culture is. So whether it's book clubs or whether it's photography clubs, things that people are just really, really passionate about, you create these. And again, this is where you really empower or utilize technology, so creating Slack groups and different competitions around celebrating and sharing what you're passionate about. So I think we have a good plan around that, but that plan is in the hands of the team, and that does tweak and change to ensure that it remains relevant and remains engaging. And that's kind of how we keep that crowdsourced kind of open dialogue open all the time.
Great. Yeah, maybe just to slightly build on that. So similar to what Rory's just saying, we have a long history of community-based at Fidelity, communities of practice, interest, also employee resource groups. But I suppose two things that I would say that are making a difference, because we're very much focused on what is the associate experience. I think everyone in this room is all concerned about what their employee or associate experience is. So two things that we found that worked pretty well for us. We've grown a lot during COVID. We were actively recruiting. So, we took an opportunity. Really what we've been focused on is how do you make the experience when you gather ostensibly different from the things you do when you're at home. Mm-hmm. So, we talked about spending hours on Zoom calls. You don't want people to come into an office space and do exactly the same thing. So, what we focused on is trying to really integrate all of the new associates and also bring their ideas into our culture. And like last November, we used Thanksgiving Day when it's a bit quieter in the States, and we had what we called a community fest. And it was an opportunity for all of our communities of practice, our ERGs, to talk about, what they do, why they do it, and also bring new people into that culture and experience. And the second thing that's really effective is we have an associate experience group, and we have connectors. So we have connectors across all of our different business areas. And they're essentially, back to Ollie's point in terms of sometimes we haven't lived this experience, they bring that experience firsthand from the grassroots community. Rather than waiting to hear it through an employee pulse survey when it's kind of in the rear window, they're actively bringing that information real time. But I think the third piece of it really is, it's a balance, right? So it has to work for the employees, but it also has to work for the company. Mm-hmm. And, you can't have everything laissez-faire, because that doesn't work either. So I think they're probably some of the things that to be very brief, Sharon, that we're focused on.
Yeah, great. You spoke, Kieran, about everyone's love of Agile. As you think about, we certainly have all, and we've talked about the tools that certainly probably wonder, are they benefiting us from a time perspective? But as you think about, is there anything you would say to, leaders in finding that right balance of the practice of Agile, the use of the tools, and the leadership component? I'm
sure, whatever it is, 93% of developers use Agile around the world. I'm sure everyone in the room has a lot of experience on using Agile well and fixing issues and so on. Just from a time point of view, one thing I would maybe draw attention to is, from a time point of view, Agile turns the dial up. So Agile, your Scrum board or whatever you have, it makes all of the work very visible. Everyone's Post-it notes are up there. So you can see, all a leader has to do is walk past the door, and they'll see on the board the colour of the Post-it notes. They'll see who's performing well and maybe not so well. And so people have time personalities. Some people love that, and they love to be on the board, and they love to be aggressively moving across and showing how they're doing things, and they've got this many Post-its completed or whatever. For others, it's not just a little stressful, it's completely unbearable. So you often see turnover of staff when you see new digital transformations or new methods like Agile adopted. Some people can't cope, even if they're the strongest developer. They can't cope if they see their time and their work and their productivity, or their perceived lack of it, struggling, if they're even second in order. So one thing I would maybe say, particularly in hybrid now, where you've got dual thing going on, and you have to have these kind of mechanisms and tools that allow both this hybrid work to happen, maybe just to be cognizant of how people are incredibly motivated in some cases, but incredibly stressed when they see their time so exposed and so visible to everyone else.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important, it's really understanding, and it's back to that human connection, meeting people where they're at. Not everybody loves that full transparency, right? So how are you very conscious as a leader that you're catering for those that do and catering for those that don't? So there's probably a good balance and probably more to be learned in that space. I'm going to do one more question, and I'm going to kind of draw upon a question that Ollie Daniels raised there earlier. The advantage of vibrant teams, is so important, and I think it's been, something that has brought a lot of work to Ireland, to the west of Ireland. I'd love to just hear your thoughts on, again, how do we continue? We live in such a distributed world, is this potentially in this new way of working, could we lose our advantages being a destination? And, just love to get your thoughts on that whole sense of vibrant teams, and how do we sell that as potentially extensions of larger companies across the globe.
Yeah, I was listening to Ollie and I was nodding vigorously, and then I was like, maybe I need to check my biases a little bit. But there's a really, really important point in that. And I spent time as chair of Technology Ireland through the pandemic, and we talked about this a lot, because ultimately, if everyone, and I say this to our leaders all the time, and they kind of look at me, and I'm going to say it because I'm among friends in the room here, but my kind of mantra on that one is, if everyone decides to spend their time at home in their pajamas in Ireland, so very quickly organisations will find a cheaper place to have someone sitting at home in their pajamas. Now, I think we've moved a lot in terms of flexibility. So I think it's balancing that flexibility with, back to what I said, the purpose of when you spend time in the office. And some of that purpose is actually, regardless of how maybe integrated you are into an organisation, you're still on show when the senior leaders come into the region, because, they may not necessarily understand the culture holistically. You might be like Rory, where you're building an organisation and, you're trying to get, that credibility for the talent. And, Ireland as an island, we don't have lots of natural resources, but talent is one that's been out there for decades and decades, and you have lots of, like American Chamber, Enterprise Ireland, IDA have worked on that. So I think as leaders, it's back to trying to connect the dots, right? So we're talking about connectedness today. So when we talk to our teams, it's not just the value that they get in terms of being part of that connection. It's also the value that the organisation gets in terms of understanding what they bring. And if you never meet them, it's very difficult. And constantly over the years, we always have visitors come and they go, my God, you can feel the buzz in the office, right? And, we had visitors, we've had a lot of visitors since COVID lifted. And in fairness, I will say, our associates have really stepped up to the plate, because most of them really understand this. They understand the connection between, our purpose in being here, the value we bring, the value that brings to the business. So I think it's really constantly about, no more than when you're trying to build a software product, you have to start with the 10,000-foot view and explain that, break it down, and then tie it back to personal purpose. And I think, with the flexibility we have, I think you can provide that personal, empowered feeling in terms of how you manage your time and where you are and where you work. But you also have to balance that with the organisational need to survive and thrive.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I'd certainly go along with everything Lorna mentioned there. And we certainly have the talent. We're in an institution that has been a phenomenal conveyor belt of world-class talent for a long time now. And hence the companies have flocked to the region to take advantage of phenomenal talent. So we have that box ticked. But again, I'm not comfortable that we are actually getting or developing that talent in a way that is actually driving the productivity that ensures that Ireland stays top of the tree in terms of expansion and growth for the future. We have eroded quite a bit of our competitive advantage due to the cost of living and the cost of doing work and salaries in the country. So the only way to be able to justify that is that our work and our innovation and our productivity goes in line in terms of up and to the right in the graph, and it isn't. Retaining employees and engaging employees is more and more difficult, and we have to adapt the way that we engage those employees. Otherwise, we will be, I fundamentally believe, in a very, very difficult position in the not too distant future, because I know personally I sit on a global balance sheet for Diligent Inc. across 11 different offices, and we're running a global business, and you will make decisions as a global organization around the cost, the productivity, the retention of staff, and the engagement of staff are for a number of metrics you will look at. And unless we continue to be top of the table when it comes to those 4 metrics, there's other jurisdictions out there that can deliver the in pajamas productivity and higher than we've been churning out over the last couple of years in particular. So I think that it's a really, really important point for us to step up. And this isn't just a corporate thing, this goes right down to grassroots, into the school system and into academia, around the comfort levels that people have, and we need to guide people to be more comfortable working back in groups again and being part of groups. And it's, you know, in my other hat, doing some work here in the university, it's definitely been a dramatic challenge of people being comfortable working in groups with different nationalities and different people from different backgrounds. And when you get into the corporate life, you don't get to choose whose team you're on and what people you work with. And we need to be able to produce and develop and invest in the talent of the future by giving them the fundamental skills in the grassroots, that by the time they move into corporate life, that we are top of the table again. But there's a massive risk out there, I believe.
Yeah, very, very good point. So with that, I'm going to open it up to the floor. We've got a couple of folks with mics, so anyone got any questions for any member of the panel?
So I'm interested that a lot of the focus has been on the kind of the challenges and negative impacts of hybrid working. But like, I suppose I put it to the, or maybe ask the panel your view on the kind of the more positive elements, you know, particularly for here in the West, and, you know, the fact that it gives us a much greater ability to connect in a much better way with colleagues in Asia, the US, across Europe than we would have had, you know, up to now. And like, you know, there's, to a certain extent, the kind of the hybrid working horse has bolted at this stage. You know, how do we kind of leverage, and to your point about time, how do we leverage our kind of our time zone as that kind of bridge in that hybrid working environment to kind of lead broader teams, more diverse teams that are, you know, more globally distributed than what we would have been able to do heretofore?
Yeah, I can just give it a short response. Like, apologies if I've come across as negative or doomsday. I don't mean to come across. Hybrid is phenomenal. It's an incredibly positive development over the last 3 years. I just don't think fundamentally that we as leaders are meeting that opportunity in the way that we can and should, to give it the space to develop and grow. So I fundamentally do believe that hybrid is a phenomenal progression, and it has been on the, you know, been called for long before COVID hastened it in. And you know, it was mentioned in one of the earlier speeches around people are finding that happiness or engagement outside of work and in other things, which is great to see, whether it's community, whether it's family, whatever it might be. That's a huge positive of the hybrid working environment. And we need to step up and continue to ensure that people also get the opportunity to gain more and more satisfaction and engagement from the corporate side, which largely has dwindled because we haven't kept pace with how we make people feel in a different workplace. So I think it's a challenge. I think with it comes a huge opportunity, for sure, and we're taking it. We're in a very healthy, largely healthy position as Ireland Inc. in terms of corporate life. But there is a really important inflection point at the moment that we want to kick on and be the global leaders that we have been for so long in so many ways. We need to make the corporate life as engaging or somewhat as engaging as the personal life, and therefore the package of hybrid becomes incredibly compelling.
Yeah, and I would say it depends on the role you're in, right? I think there's, hybrid is not today or yesterday. Most companies in the west of Ireland have been doing some form of flexible working for a long, long time. But I think it's finding that balance, right? And I think it's back to, I think I mentioned a little bit earlier in terms of, what's different. And we all do different types of activities. Some of them are better suited to different modes of working. But I think ultimately, we've just gone through 2 change curves. So I think there's a lot of people, if you think of the change curve, there's a lot of people sitting in the trough of discontent at the moment. So, when I remember when we had to, suddenly go home during COVID, I was getting emails from people going, I hate this, I can't cope with it, I can't deal with it. And similarly, we're hearing people like, I've organised my life and, this is a really inconvenience to go and change it over again. But I think we have to work with people, and I think Rory is absolutely right. There are huge advantages. There's advantages for business, there's advantages for being part of global teams. But, you cannot be an island sitting at home all of the time. That doesn't mean that you can't be hugely effective working in a solo space for part of your working life. And I think it's about finding that balance in terms of what works for you personally, what works for you in terms of your broader social engagement, but also balancing that with what works for the organisation to be effective. Great. Eric.
Yeah, thank you. Great discussion, and I think a lot of us are talking about sort of how really the culture is evolving, right? And it seems to me a lot of discussion is about how should we work? How do we bring people into the office? It's very in the here and now. It's like the immediate fix, right? And then, Kieran, you talked about the research study you're doing, fascinating, tracking people's behavior, and you talked about the evidence-based approach you're hoping to get from that. It seems to me, though, that kind of leaves out potentially the idea that it's going to change over time. Through COVID, we had this, immediate kick, everything changed. We're all talking about it here. But I'm interested in the panel's view in terms of how do we commit to a longer term investment to evolve and change the culture so that we get that human connection that we talked about in the opening talk. It seems we need a longer term plan rather than what are we going to do tomorrow to make it better.
Yeah.
So maybe just on that, definitely I agree. Part of the research, using this evidence-based approach, part of it is about the immediate thing. So, we look at trace data across these teams and organisations, but we'll find some kind of long-term trends and long-term rhythms and patterns. So it seems, on certain days of the week or certain times or after certain events, there tends to be more value in everyone being in, or at least many being in, or some being in, or whatever. So definitely, you can see patterns emerge over time, and then you can start to form maybe longer-term policies. But also then when we analyse this trace data, we look for moments, I think that was mentioned earlier on, moments where something went really well on the positive side, or didn't go well. And then we chat to people involved in those things, and we'll identify those moments and how we could have avoided them, or how we can avoid them in the future. And sometimes it's an immediate change, short-term change, fix. Sometimes it's more of a long-term. And that applies, when I think of these moments, it applies definitely in our workforce, with the work studies with these agile teams across these tech organizations. But also, like we're studying, 4 and 5-year-old children and their use of technology, and a child with autism. So an event or a moment can be a really negative moment or something like that. And the same thing happens there. It could be that, there was a short-term fix that should have been done and can be done now when next time it happens. Or sometimes it's actually, this is a long-term policy. We can't let that happen again. So there's a permanent long-term fix for it.
And I would say culture is constantly evolving. Don't take it just because we're talking about things we're doing in the here and now that we're not thinking on a very long time horizon. But I think we also have to think more broadly outside of our organisations. So, think about events like this where you have connection between lots of different companies. If no one was talking to each other, they just wouldn't happen. And then you have to think more broadly in terms of the social and economic implications. So, people are observing it. So I was in Dublin a few weeks ago, and I got into a cab, and the cab driver in the typical witty Dublin said, "So are you one of those twats?" And I was like, "What's a twat?" I was going over to the Docklands, and he was like, "Oh yeah, they're the people who work Tuesday, Wednesdays and Thursdays. We call them twats in the trade." So there's even a new social vernacular coming out of the changes in terms of how we work. So I think we spent so much time individually during COVID focused on our individual circumstances. It's really now a conversation about how do you broaden that horizon from you know, yourself is important personally, but also think about your team, think about your organisation, think about your community. To Ollie's point, think about your country. And I'm not doing an Uncle Sam piece here, but I think it is important because, you know, there's lots of, you know, certain countries do different things. Like, for instance, we have an office in Chennai in India, and the government dictated that everyone has to be in work 2 weeks in the month because the whole ecosystem of that city relied commercially on those large companies actually working in the area. So we have to think more broadly. And I think, you know, back to what I said earlier, is bringing that 10,000 foot view, both socially, culturally, you know, personally, economically. You have to have much more broad-based conversation, you know, and that's kind of how we will continue to evolve culture and hopefully to, you know, I would have the same concerns as you have, Rory, in terms of, you know, is there a better option? We need to show the world that, you know, we're still here and we still want to be number one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think probably just very briefly, kind of building on Lorna's points there and one from earlier, I think a very important way to evolve and ensure that this is a long-term kind of growth trajectory we're on by embracing hybrid working environments is genuinely to embrace a coaching culture where we talk less and listen more as leaders. And Lorna mentioned at the opening as to the reason why she didn't bother doing slides, was active listening. The art of that is incredibly, it's very, very difficult to find. People who can actually listen and really understand what people are saying, not just with what comes out of their mouth, but how they're saying it. And again, coaching is that. You listen and you help the person figure stuff out themselves, so the next time they meet a similar situation, they'll have the resilience and the know-how and the muscle memory to adapt and address it. Companies that adopt, I believe, a coaching culture are setting themselves and their teams up for the unknown, but taking advantage of what is coming down the line. And it's that commitment to lifelong learning and those type of environments that people will benefit and grow from. So I think from a long-term perspective, that's something that I think is a really, really important thing that as leaders and as organizational mantras, coaching cultures, and really listening and understanding individuals, being intentional about their motivations and developing them as individuals and not just as numbers. A collective commitment to that, I believe, will give any organization an added advantage, not just nationally, but internationally.
Great. Well, look at just in the interest of time, which seems to be the underlying theme. Thank you for all our three panelists. I think great insights, and maybe there's some things here that, you know, as we think forward to next year's AtlanTec Festival, maybe this conversation will have moved on, and it'll be really interesting to see where it'll have moved on to. And as you said, Eric, some of this is point in time, but, you know, there's definitely a longer journey here. So looking forward to see what that evolution might be over the course of the next year. So with that, we'll take a 15-minute break if we can everyone back so that we can somewhat try and get back on track. That would be wonderful. Thank you.